Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. On the morning of December 26, 2004, 7-year-old Martunis, who lived in the Aceh region of Indonesia, woke up as usual full of joy. In their small, humble home, his mother was preparing breakfast, while his father and sister were getting ready for their daily tasks. Outside, life continued as normal. People were heading to the market, children were playing in the streets, and fishermen were preparing to set out to sea. No one knew that in a few hours their lives would change forever. At 7:58 a.m., a massive 9.1 magnitude earthquake occurred deep beneath the Indian Ocean. This tremor was one of the strongest earthquakes recorded in history. The earthquake was so powerful that even people on the coast felt a slight vibration, but no one realized that it was a warning of an impending disaster. Due to the inadequacy of the tsunami warning systems, most of the public remained unaware of the danger. About half an hour after the earthquake, the ocean's surface began to ominously recede. Children playing on the beach and fishermen, seeing the water rapidly pulling away from the shore, stared in disbelief. Some ran toward the beach where they saw sea creatures and fish that they'd never seen before. But no one knew that this calm was just the quiet before the storm. Martunis and his family were having breakfast at home at that moment. Within minutes, a massive wall of water appeared on the horizon. These tsunami waves, rising up to 15 meters high, were racing towards the shore at a speed of 800 kilometers per hour. When Martunis's family heard the panicked screams from outside, they began to realize the magnitude of the disaster. People were desperately trying to escape, and cars, motorcycles, and pedestrians were mixed together in narrow streets. Martunis's father, seeing the waves rapidly approaching, shouted, "Run! We need to go higher!" His mother picked up little Martunis and began running quickly with the crowd. However, escaping was not as easy as they had hoped. The waves were swallowing entire buildings, trees, and people, leaving nothing behind. Martunis and his family turned down a street, trying to reach higher ground. But escape routes had already been flooded. The ocean was devouring the city like a giant monster. Martunis tightly held his mother's hand. But suddenly a huge mass of water crashed into them. Martunis found himself flying through the air, tumbling through the spinning water. Everything around him disappeared, and the world was suddenly consumed by the dark and suffocating water. Martunis struggled to stay alive, flailing in the waves. Just moments before, he had been holding his mother's hand, but now he was completely alone. The giant wave pulled him up and then quickly down. When he opened his eyes underwater, he saw cars, tree trunks, and debris floating around him. Struggling to keep from drowning, he tried to surface, but the waves kept pulling him down. Struggling to breathe, he desperately tried to hold on to something. For a moment, he managed to grab a broken piece of wood and was swept along with the waves. Most of the buildings along the coast had been destroyed, and the city had become unrecognizable. People were screaming, houses were being swept away, and cars were floating in the water. Martunis was lost in the waves, and to survive, he had to rely solely on his own strength. Thus, Martunis's battle for survival began. As Martunis was tossed, by the power of the massive waves, he found himself completely submerged for a moment. Salt water filled his lungs, and as he struggled to breathe, the chaos around him offered no opportunity to catch his breath. Just moments ago, he had been with his family, but now he was completely alone. As he was dragged under the waves, floating, debris, broken tree branches, and wrecked house pieces surrounded him. In his unconscious struggle, his fingers brushed against a piece of wood. With his last strength, he grabbed it and managed to surface. When he took a deep breath, his throat burned from the salt water, but when he realized he could breathe, a small glimmer of hope stirred within him. The waves relentlessly carried him forward. His own town was now submerged, and nothing familiar was left in his sight. On the water's surface, there was a vast sea of wreckage. Broken boats, toppled electricity poles, severed tree trunks, and even overturned cars. Martunis could hear the cries for help of people around him. Some were trying to cling to debris, while others were being swept away by the water. The screams gradually diminished, and the number of survivors was decreasing with every passing minute. As the waves pushed Martunis further from the shore and pulled him inland, he lost track of time. It felt as though he had been on the water for hours, but it could have been just a few minutes. His eyes were beginning to close from exhaustion, and he struggled to stay awake, desperate not to be swallowed by the water. He was hungry, thirsty, and his body was growing weak. The sun blazed overhead, intensifying his thirst. With every passing second, his body felt heavier, and his arms were too weak to hold onto the piece of wood much longer. But something inside him told him not to.
Give up.
If he gave in here, no one would ever find him. As time passed, the sky began to darken. The sunset brought even greater fear. With the sun, at least he could see his surroundings, but as night fell, the dark waters became more frightening. He felt completely alone in the ocean. Strange sounds from beneath the water, the movements of unknown creatures unnerved him. The waves slowly began to decrease and the water level calmed a bit. Martunis briefly wanted to let himself fall asleep, but he didn't know if he could open his eyes again if he closed them. Shivering, he struggled to keep himself awake. Shivering in the cold of the night, Martunis opened his eyes with the first light of dawn. He was still on the water, but now he had been swept into a stagnant swamp area. This was his chance. If he could get out of here, maybe he could survive. However, the coming days would turn into an even greater struggle for him. When Martunis opened his eyes, the sun had already risen. The pain in his body was so intense that he lay still for a moment. The hot, humid air filled his lungs, and he felt his hunger and thirst more than ever. The terrifying cold of the night had given way to oppressive heat. He hadn't died, but that didn't mean he would survive. The tsunami had swept him far from the shore into a flooded swamp. The area around him was filled with muddy water and partially submerged trees. Toppled electricity poles and debris carried inland by the tsunami littered the landscape. Martunis was now in the midst of a dangerous loneliness. Martunis's throat was dry and his stomach was empty. He couldn't remember when he had last eaten. Hunger and thirst were weakening him and his vision was blurring. But if he wanted to survive, he had to do something. First, he needed to find water. The salty seawater brought by the tsunami was undrinkable, and the puddles around him were full of mud. But luck was on his side. Rainwater from the night before had collected in the trunk of a fallen tree. With trembling hands, he bent down and scooped the water into his hands, drinking it. As he drank, he felt some relief, but this water wouldn't last forever. He needed to find more. Hunger, however, was a different problem. He hadn't eaten anything, and he couldn't survive like this. He slowly began to walk toward the shore, inching his way forward. Along the way, he examined the debris. Broken pieces of wood and objects trapped in the mud. Then a plastic bag caught his attention. Inside, there was a pack of biscuits that had swollen from the heat. He opened the bag and quickly began eating the biscuits. He chewed without tasting, desperately trying to fill his stomach. These biscuits were a blessing for his survival. In that moment, he realized that if he couldn't find more food, he would lose his strength and wouldn't survive. So he carefully began to examine other pieces of debris that had been swept away by the water. By chance, he found a fruit crate washed up on the shore. Most of the fruit was spoiled and inedible, but a few pieces were still good to eat. He collected them and kept them with him. The scorching heat of the day gave way to an eerie and freezing night. The swamp became a complete nightmare after dark. It was surrounded by strange sounds that he didn't recognize. The croaking of frogs, the rustling of unknown animals, and distant muffled screams. He was terrified. Finding a dry place to lie down was difficult because everywhere was covered in mud and water. Martunis climbed a branch of a fallen tree and wrapped himself in his wet clothes, trying to sleep. But a restful sleep was impossible. Hunger and thirst were already hard enough to endure. Now cold and fear had been added. He was alone and didn't know when he would be found. Martunis's first day in the swamp was entirely spent fighting to survive. But he knew this was just the beginning. The coming days would be even more difficult and dangerous. He had to find food, drink water, and most importantly, he couldn't lose hope. At that moment, he made a promise to himself. He would survive and reunite with his family. For Martunis, the days started to blend together. He didn't know how. Many days had passed, but his body was no longer the same. Hunger, thirst, and exhaustion were weakening him. Things he could do easily before now seemed very difficult. His legs were trembling, his head was spinning, and every movement made him feel like he would collapse at any moment. Yet his mind was still resisting. Something inside him kept telling him not to give up. If he gave up here, no one would find him. He had to survive. One morning, while rummaging through debris, a red and green piece of cloth caught his attention. When he looked closer, he realized it was a football jersey. He was surprised when he recognized the Portuguese national team logo on it. He loved football, and he had heard Cristiano Ronaldo's name before. He didn't know how this jersey had ended up here, but when he picked it up, he felt a strange strength. It felt like this jersey would give him the power to keep going. He immediately put it on. His old clothes were already torn, dirty, and soaked. This new shirt would protect him from the heat and give him a morale boost. This small moment brought back the hope he had lost. Even though he felt lonely and helpless, he thought he needed to fight like a football player. Just like players on the field who never give up, he had to fight against this disaster. Martunis' heart began to race when he heard the sound of helicopters in the distance. He looked up at the sky, and when he saw the helicopters appearing through the clouds, a surge of excitement filled him. The rescue teams had finally reached the area. However, the helicopters were too high, and spotting him was almost impossible. Desperately, he started waving his hands and shouted at the top of his lungs, "I'm here! Help me!" But his voice came out weak and hoarse. His body was so exhausted that even his voice wasn't as strong as it used to be. A few of the helicopters scanned the coastline, but none came close to the swamp area where Martunis was. At that moment, he felt as if his hope of being rescued had shattered. His eyes filled with tears, and he collapsed to the ground in despair. But then he gave himself one more chance. He had to wait. If they had come this close, they would eventually spot him. All he had to do was endure and wait for the right moment. Martunis started to get more creative with his survival methods every passing day. He continued drinking rainwater and collected small bits of food that washed ashore. But his biggest enemy was loneliness. At night, he started talking to himself because he felt that if he didn't, his mind would give up. Sometimes he would look at the sky and wonder if his family was still alive. He imagined his mother, father, and sister. Would he ever see them again? This uncertainty was the hardest part for him. But one day, he was sure that someone would find him. And until then, he had to keep fighting. Martunis had been fighting to survive in this swamp for exactly 21 days. Each day had been spent with hunger, thirst, loneliness, and fear. His strength was nearly gone, but his mind kept telling him not to give up. He could no longer count the days, but his body had become so weak that even moving was difficult. Hunger was stabbing his stomach, and thirst was choking his throat. The Portuguese national team jersey he wore was now dirty and torn, but he still believed it gave him strength. That morning, Martunis was waiting as he had every day, wondering if a rescue team would finally spot him. But just like the previous days, no one had come. He tried to keep his spirits up by talking to himself. "One day they'll find me. I just have to wait," he whispered. But just as he was about to lose all hope, he heard the sound of an engine coming from far away. At first, he couldn't tell if it was real. His mind was clouded with hunger and thirst. But then, he realized, the sound was getting closer. Squinting his eyes and looking towards the horizon, he saw the silhouettes of several people moving through the shallow waters. They were the rescue teams and journalists. His heart began to race. But he was so weak that he didn't have the strength to get up and run. He wanted to raise his hand and wave, but even his arm felt heavy. Weakly, in a hoarse voice, he whispered, "I'm here," but no one heard him. If he didn't make himself known, they could pass by without noticing him. Gathering his last strength, he took a deep breath and, summoning all his energy, shouted, "I'm here, please help." And at that moment, one of them turned their head and looked at him. At first, no one on the team could believe he was alive. It seemed impossible for such a young child to have survived alone for so long. However, Martunis's eyes showed that the fire of life within him hadn't yet been extinguished. One of the rescuers quickly ran toward him. Martunis's body was so weak that he was barely skin and bones. His lips were dry, his skin burned, and his feet were covered in wounds. But the hope in his eyes still shone brightly. The team immediately gave him water. When he took the first sip, tears filled his eyes as the water passed down his throat. After days of drinking muddy water, the taste of clean water felt like heaven to him. One of the rescuers asked in a trembling voice, "How many days have you been here?" Martuni's voice was weak but clear. "I think 21 days." This answer shocked everyone around him. It was unbelievable that such a young child had survived alone for 3 weeks. Journalists were also surprised to see that Martunis was wearing a Portuguese national team jersey. One of them asked him, "Where did you find this jersey?" Martunis smiled and whispered softly, "It kept me alive." The team quickly laid him on a stretcher and prepared to take him to the nearest hospital. As Martunis was lifted into the helicopter, he finally felt safe. A sense of relief filled him. When they reached the hospital, doctors immediately began treating him. His body was severely dehydrated, he had vitamin deficiencies, and he had become very weak. But most importantly, he was alive. Martunis's survival story spread to the whole world within a few days. News channels covered his miraculous rescue, and people were in awe of his courage. He was no longer just a child. He had become a symbol of survival from the tsunami disaster. Even the Portuguese national team heard about his story and sent him supportive messages. Cristiano Ronaldo himself said that he was amazed by the determination and courage of this little boy. Martunis had survived, but it wasn't just by chance. He had survived because he resisted, because he never gave up. And now, a new life awaited him. Martunis had managed to survive. His fight against nature, hunger, thirst, and loneliness for 21 days had finally brought him back into the world of people. But his story wasn't over yet. The real adventure was just beginning. Martunis's rescue sent shockwaves around the world. Newspapers, television stations, and news websites carried the incredible survival story of this little boy on their headlines. People were amazed at how he had stayed so strong despite his young age. But the group that was most affected by Martunis's story was the Portuguese national team, especially Cristiano Ronaldo. When his story reached Portugal, both the Portuguese Football Federation and Cristiano Ronaldo wanted to help this brave child. Cristiano Ronaldo was deeply moved by Martunis's fight for survival. Therefore, he decided to travel to Indonesia to support the young boy. When Martunis heard this news, he could hardly believe it. The jersey that had kept him alive had now become a real miracle. A world star like Cristiano Ronaldo truly wanted to meet him, and finally the big day arrived. When Cristiano Ronaldo reached Aceh, he was greeted by a large crowd. However, the only person Ronaldo wanted to meet was Martunis. Excited and overwhelmed with happiness, Martunis went to meet Ronaldo. The little boy who had once waited alone and desperately for rescue was now face to face with one of the world's most famous footballers. Ronaldo approached Martunis and embraced him tightly. "You are a true warrior," he said. "Your courage and determination inspire everyone." Martunis's eyes filled with tears. At that moment, all the pain, hunger, fear, and loneliness he had experienced were replaced by immense happiness. He knew that he was no longer alone. The Portuguese Football Federation was also deeply moved by Martunis's story. They decided to support his education and future. They provided him with a scholarship for football training and opened the doors to a brand new life for him. With this support, Martunis had the opportunity he had always dreamed of. He was no longer just a child who survived. He was on his way to becoming a footballer with a bright future. Over the years, Martunis gave his life a new direction. His love for football never faded, and he began to grow up in Portugal's football culture. With the support of the Portuguese Football Federation, he joined Sporting Lisbon's Youth Academy, the famous club where Cristiano Ronaldo also developed. For him, it was the fulfillment of a dream. Once lost in the tsunami waters, struggling for survival, he was now a young boy trying to prove himself on the football field. Martunis's story didn't remain just a survival tale. He became an inspiration for many people. Despite the disaster he had gone through, he never gave up, he fought, and he chased his dreams. Today, Martunis is recognized not only in the football world, but also globally as an inspiring figure. His story has become an example that shows no matter how difficult the situation, with belief and determination, anything is possible. Martunis is now not just the child who survived the tsunami disaster. He is a hero who gives hope to others with his struggle.